It was a frigid Christmas Eve in the snow-covered hills of Montana. The highways were treacherous, icy ribbons winding through towering pine trees dusted in white. The Whitaker family was on their way to Grandma June's cozy farmhouse for their annual holiday gathering. Inside the car, the atmosphere was warm despite the cold outside. Holly, the mother, hummed softly to Bing Crosby's White Christmas playing on the radio. Beside her, Eric, her husband, was focused on the icy road ahead. In the back seat, 10-year-old Lucas was excitedly counting the gifts they'd packed, while his 6-year-old sister Mia clutched her favorite stuffed bear. But amidst this cheerful scene was a quiet observer, Shadow, their sleek black cat with piercing green eyes. He lay curled up in Lucas's lap, his fur absorbing the boy's gentle strokes. Shadow had been with the Whitakers for 4 years, ever since Eric had found the tiny kitten abandoned near their home. Shadow was more than just a pet. He was part of the family. Though calm and reserved, he seemed to sense emotions with uncanny precision, comforting the children when they were sick, curling up with Holly during her moments of stress, and even pawing Eric's arm when he worked late into the night. The road twisted sharply as the snow fell harder, turning into a near-blinding storm. Holly glanced at Eric nervously. "Maybe we should pull over until the storm calms down," she suggested, gripping the armrest. Eric frowned, glancing at the clock. It was already late, and they were still an hour away. "We'll take it slow," he assured her, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Shadow's ears twitched, his eyes fixed out the window as though sensing something amiss. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, a deer darted across the icy road. Eric swerved instinctively to avoid it, but the car skidded on the slick surface. "Hold on," Eric shouted as the vehicle spun out of control. Time seemed to slow as the car veered off the road, plowing into a snowbank and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. Inside the car, the Whitakers were stunned and shaken. Eric's head throbbed where it had hit the steering wheel. But he was conscious. Holly's arm was pinned awkwardly against the door, and though it ached, she was able to move. Lucas and Mia cried out, terrified but unharmed. Shadow had been thrown from Lucas's lap, now crouched on the dashboard with his back arched, his emerald eyes wide with alarm. The car was badly damaged, its front end crumpled like paper. Worse, the impact had bent the doors, trapping the family inside. Eric tried to force his door open, but it wouldn't budge. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Holly nodded, wincing in pain. "I think my arm might be sprained." "Daddy, I'm scared," Mia whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eric turned to his children. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going to be fine," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The cold was seeping into the car now, biting at their skin. The snowfall was relentless, quickly burying the vehicle under a heavy white blanket. They were miles from the nearest town with no cell signal to call for help. As the minutes ticked by, the temperature inside the car dropped and fear began to set in. What if no one found them? What if the storm worsened? But amidst the fear and despair, Shadow moved. The black cat, still perched on the dashboard, began to pace, his tail flicking with purpose. He pawed at the windshield, his sharp claws making tiny, desperate scratches on the frosted glass. "Shadow, stop," Lucas said weakly, his teeth chattering. But the cat ignored him, leaping onto Eric's lap and staring out the driver's side window. Then Shadow did something strange. He yowled, a loud, piercing cry that cut through the storm's howl. The family exchanged confused glances. Shadow had always been a quiet cat, rarely making a sound. But now his cries were urgent, insistent. He leaped onto the dashboard again and scratched at the window, his movements frantic. "What's gotten into him?" Holly asked, her breath visible in the freezing air. Eric shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe he's just scared." But Shadow wasn't scared. He was determined. As the snow continued to pile up around the car, Shadow's cries grew louder, more forceful. He wasn't just making noise, he was calling out for something. And as he yowled, his sharp eyes darted to the windshield, then to the side window, as though he were looking for someone or something. Eric watched the cat in bewilderment. "What are you doing, buddy?" he muttered. Then it hit him. "Do you think he's trying to get help?" "How could he possibly do that?" Holly asked incredulously. Eric didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and opened the small gap in the driver's side window, just wide enough for the cat to squeeze through. "Eric, what are you doing?" Holly cried, alarmed. "Just trust me," Eric said. He turned to Shadow. "Go, boy. Do whatever it is you're trying to do." Without hesitation, Shadow darted out into the blizzard. The family watched in stunned silence as the sleek black figure disappeared into the white void, his tail held high against the driving snow. Little did they know, their lives now depended on him. The Whitaker family sat in stunned silence as the icy wind roared through the small gap in the window where Shadow had slipped out. Inside the car, the temperature was dropping fast, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Holly held Mia close, wrapping her scarf around the little girl to keep her warm. Lucas was curled up in his seat, hugging his knees. Eric, trying to remain calm, inspected his watch every few minutes, as if that might somehow speed up their rescue. The minutes dragged into an hour. The storm showed no sign of relenting. Snow had almost completely buried the car, and the faint light from the headlights barely penetrated the thick white blanket. Eric's heart sank as he realized they were becoming invisible to anyone passing by on the highway, if anyone was even out there in the storm. "Do you think he'll come back?" Lucas asked softly, breaking the tense silence. "Shadow always comes back," Holly said, trying to sound reassuring. But even she wasn't sure. How could a small cat possibly find help in a blizzard? The thought of Shadow lost out there, alone and freezing, made her throat tighten. She pressed her injured arm against her chest, wincing at the sharp pain, and tried to keep her composure for the sake of her children. Eric gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He had always been the protector, the fixer. But now he was powerless, trapped in a mangled car with his family depending on him. His mind raced with grim possibilities. What if Shadow didn't come back? What if no one found them in time? Meanwhile, outside, Shadow was on a mission. The snow was nearly as tall as he was, but he moved with determination, his sleek black form weaving through the drifts like a shadow come to life. His fur was coated in frost, his paws numb from the cold, but he pressed on, driven by some instinct that even he couldn't understand. Shadow had spent his entire life as a quiet observer, a silent comfort to his human family. But now, something inside him had awakened. He knew the Whitakers needed help, and he was their only chance. The highway was barely visible under the snow, and Shadow had no way of knowing which direction to go. But he seemed to trust his instincts, following the faint scent of oil and rubber that lingered on the wind. His green eyes glinted in the darkness, scanning the storm for any sign of movement. Then, in the distance, a faint glow appeared, a pair of headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Shadow froze, his body low to the ground, watching as the lights grew closer. It was a plow truck, its massive blade clearing the snow from the highway. Shadow waited until the truck was almost upon him, then darted into the middle of the road, his black fur stark against the white. The driver slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. "What the hell?" the man muttered, peering out the windshield. He saw the cat sitting in the road, its green eyes fixed on him. At first, he thought it was just a stray, but something about the way the cat stared at him gave him pause. Shadow let out a loud, piercing yowl, a sound so desperate it made the man shiver. All right, he said, opening the door and stepping out into the snow. "What's your deal, huh?" The man, a burly figure in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, crouched down, holding out a gloved hand. "You lost, little guy?" Shadow didn't approach him. Instead, he turned and bolted a few feet, then stopped and looked back, as if urging the man to follow. The driver frowned, confused. "You want me to follow you?" he muttered. When Shadow yowled again and ran a few more feet, the man's confusion turned to curiosity, and then concern. "All right, let's see what you're trying to show me." He climbed back into his truck, turned on the high beams, and slowly followed the cat. Shadow led the truck off the main highway and down a narrow, snow-covered embankment. The driver hesitated. This wasn't a safe place to take the truck, especially in these conditions. But something about the cat's urgency convinced him to keep going. After a few minutes, the faint outline of the Whitaker's car came into view, half buried in snow. The driver's heart jumped. "Holy, there's people in there," he exclaimed, grabbing his radio. Inside the car, the Whitakers heard the faint rumble of the truck's engine. Eric's head snapped up. "Do you hear that?" he asked. His voice filled with sudden hope. Holly sat up straighter, straining to listen. The faint sound grew louder, and then, through the snow-covered windshield, they saw the glare of headlights. "It's someone!" Lucas shouted, his voice breaking with relief. Eric leaned against the horn, sending out a desperate series of blasts. Outside, the truck came to a stop, and the driver jumped out, waving a flashlight. "Hey, are you okay in there?" he shouted, his voice muffled by the wind. "We're trapped," Eric called back, his voice shaking with relief. "The doors won't open." The driver nodded and ran back to his truck, grabbing a crowbar and a heavy blanket. He returned and began working to pry open the driver's side door. It took several minutes of grunting and straining, but finally, the door gave way with a loud creak. One by one, the family was helped out of the car and wrapped in blankets. Mia clung to Holly, crying softly, while Lucas stood shivering beside Eric. The driver looked at them with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're lucky I found you," he said. "Another hour in there, and things could have gotten real bad." Eric looked around, his eyes scanning the snow. "Where's Shadow?" he asked. The driver frowned. "The cat. He's the reason I found you. He ran right in front of my truck and led me here." Eric stared at him in disbelief. "He brought you here?" The driver nodded. "Smart little guy? I've never seen anything like it." Holly's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Mia tighter. "He saved us," she whispered. But Shadow was nowhere to be seen. The bitter wind stung Eric's face as he scanned the endless expanse of white. "Shadow," he called, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Shadow, come back!" His breath puffed into the freezing air, dissipating into the storm like a fleeting hope. The Whitakers were huddled in the cab of the plow truck, wrapped in thick blankets the driver had given them. Holly held Mia and Lucas close, trying to keep them warm, but her eyes kept darting toward Eric, who refused to leave the snowbank where their car was stuck. "Come back in, man," the driver yelled from the truck. His name was Dale, and though his gruff demeanor suggested he was used to Montana's harsh winters, even he was concerned about the worsening storm. "You'll freeze out there. We've got to get your family to safety." Eric turned toward the truck, his face tight with worry. "I can't just leave him," he said, his voice cracking. "He's out there somewhere. He saved us." Dale sighed and shook his head. "That cat's got more sense than most people I know, but the storm's getting worse. You've got kids to think about." Eric looked back into the swirling snow, torn. Shadow was more than just a pet. He was family. The thought of leaving him behind felt unbearable, but Dale was right. Holly and the kids were shivering despite the warmth of the truck, and Mia's cheeks were tinged with a worrying shade of pink from the cold. Reluctantly, Eric trudged back to the truck and climbed into the passenger seat. "We'll come back for him," he said softly, though the words felt hollow. Holly placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Dale put the truck in gear and began the slow, careful journey back to town. The headlights carved a narrow path through the blizzard, the wipers working furiously to keep the windshield clear. Inside the cab, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken fears. Lucas sat quietly, his hands clutching his knees. Mia had fallen asleep against Holly's chest, her small body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Eric stared out the window, his jaw clenched. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and worry. He should have been able to protect his family and Shadow. How had it come to this? But out in the storm, Shadow was still moving. The sleek black cat had found shelter under a fallen tree, his fur dusted with snow. His body trembled from the cold, but his piercing green eyes remained alert. Shadow was no ordinary cat. He seemed to have an uncanny understanding of the world around him. He knew the truck had left, but he also knew his mission wasn't over. When the wind lulled for a brief moment, Shadow slipped out from under the tree and resumed his trek. His paws sank into the snow with each step, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than instinct. He moved with purpose, heading in the direction of distant lights that shimmered faintly through the storm. The lights belonged to the small town of Clearwater, where the local fire station was a hub of activity that night. The storm had caused several accidents, and the fire chief, a burly man named Tom Wilson, was organizing rescue efforts. Tom was sitting at his desk, reviewing reports, when he heard a commotion near the entrance. One of the firefighters, a young rookie named Jake, burst into the room, his face flushed. "Chief, you've got to see this," Jake said breathlessly. "What is it?" Tom asked, rising from his chair. "It's a cat," Jake said, sounding both incredulous and amused. Tom frowned. "A cat? Yeah, but it's acting weird, like it's trying to get our attention." Tom followed Jake to the station's garage, where the fire trucks were parked. There, in the corner, was Shadow. His black fur was matted with snow, and his body trembled from the cold, but his eyes were sharp and full of determination. "He just wandered in," Jake explained. "We opened the door to check the trucks, and he bolted inside, started meowing like crazy." Tom crouched down, studying the cat. "He's not just meowing," he said slowly. "He's trying to tell us something." Shadow let out a loud yowl, his tail flicking as he paced in a tight circle. He paused to look at Tom, then darted toward the garage door, stopping to look back at him. Tom straightened, his gut telling him there was more to this cat than met the eye. "Open the door," he ordered. "Are you serious?" Jake asked, bewildered. "Do it," Tom insisted. Jake hesitated but complied, hitting the button to open the garage door. The freezing wind blasted into the room, and Shadow darted outside. He stopped a few feet away, looking back at them with an almost impatient expression. "He wants us to follow him," Tom said, grabbing his coat. "Chief, it's a cat," Jake protested. "And that cat just walked through a blizzard to get here," Tom shot back. "Something's up. Grab the gear and get the truck ready." Reluctantly, Jake and a few other firefighters suited up and followed Tom out to one of the fire trucks. Shadow waited until the engine roared to life, then began trotting ahead, leading the way. Back in the plow truck, Eric's thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of Dale's CB radio. A voice came through, tense but clear. "Fire Station 3 responding to a possible stranded vehicle, following an unusual lead. Over." Eric sat up straighter. "What was that?" he asked. Dale frowned, adjusting the dial. "Sounds like they're on a rescue mission." "Did they say they were following a lead?" Holly asked, hope flickering in her voice. Dale nodded slowly. "Yeah. Said it was unusual." Eric's heart raced. "It has to be him. It has to be Shadow." The fire truck roared through the snowstorm, its red and white lights flashing against the endless white expanse. Inside, Tom Wilson gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he followed the trail of paw prints that appeared briefly in the snow before being swallowed by the wind. Shadow darted ahead of them, pausing every so often to make sure the truck was following. Tom had seen a lot in his 25 years as fire chief. Floods, forest fires, accidents. But this was a first. Jake sat in the passenger seat, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe we're trusting a cat to lead us through a blizzard," he muttered. "That cat didn't walk into our station for no reason," Tom shot back. "And if there's a chance someone's out there, we're going to find them." Shadow's black figure was barely visible in the storm, but he kept moving, his steps purposeful and steady despite the biting wind. His small body was trembling from the cold, his fur coated with frost, but he didn't stop. Somewhere out there, his family needed him, and he wasn't going to fail them. Meanwhile, back in Dale's plow truck, Eric was pacing anxiously, the cramped space doing little to contain his restlessness. Holly watched him with a mixture of concern and hope. "Do you really think it's him?" she asked softly, stroking Mia's hair as the little girl slept against her shoulder. Eric stopped and looked at her, his eyes bright with determination. "It has to be," he said. "Shadow's smart. He's not just going to run off without a reason." Lucas, who had been silent for most of the ride, finally spoke up. "Shadow's a hero," he said firmly, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and belief. "He always knows what to do." Eric crouched beside his son and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're right, buddy," he said, "and I promise we're going to find him." Just as he spoke, the CB radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice was more urgent. "This is Fire Station 3. We've located a stranded vehicle in the snow. Occupants may be in distress. Requesting backup. Over." Dale grabbed the radio, his eyes narrowing. "This is Dale Carter, snowplow operator. I've got the family you're looking for. They're safe, but they're missing a cat, a black one. Over." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Copy that. We're following a black cat right now. He's leading us straight to you." Eric's heart leapt. "That's him," he exclaimed, gripping the back of Dale's seat. "It's Shadow." Holly covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Lucas let out a small, triumphant cheer. Even Dale, usually stoic, cracked a smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. The fire truck pulled up next to the Whitakers' abandoned car, its headlights illuminating the crushed snowbank. Tom and his team jumped out, their boots crunching in the snow as they assessed the scene. Shadow, exhausted but still determined, stood at the edge of the headlight's beam, his green eyes glowing like tiny lanterns. Tom crouched down, holding out his hand. "Good job, buddy," he said softly. Shadow didn't move at first. His legs were trembling, his body stiff from the cold. But when Tom gently scooped him up, the cat didn't resist. Instead, Shadow let out a weak, raspy meow, as if to say, "I did it." Jake stared in awe. "He actually led us here," he said. "Yeah," Tom replied, cradling the cat against his chest. "And now we're going to make sure he's okay too." Just as Tom carried Shadow into the truck to warm him up, Dale's plow truck arrived, its engine rumbling to a stop beside them. The Whitakers spilled out, their blankets trailing behind them. "Shadow," Lucas yelled, sprinting through the snow despite the wind whipping at his face. Tom knelt down, carefully placing Shadow on the ground. The cat perked up slightly at the sound of Lucas's voice, his tail twitching weakly. "Shadow." Lucas dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he scooped the cat into his arms. Shadow let out a soft purr, his body relaxing for the first time since he had left the car. Eric and Holly joined them, their relief palpable. Holly gently stroked Shadow's frost-covered fur, her own tears mixing with the snow on her face. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved all of us." Even Dale, standing off to the side, couldn't hide the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got one hell of a cat there," he said gruffly. The firefighters worked quickly to load the Whitakers into the fire truck, ensuring everyone was warm and safe. Shadow was wrapped in a thick blanket and placed in Lucas's lap, where he immediately curled up, his small body finally able to rest. As the fire truck made its way back to Clearwater, the family sat together, huddled in shared warmth and gratitude. Shadow's soft purring filled the quiet space, a sound that seemed to wash away the fear and cold that had gripped them for so long. Tom glanced back at them from the driver's seat, a rare smile on his weathered face. "That cat's a hero," he said. Eric nodded, his arm around Holly. "Yeah, he is," he said. "He's our hero." By the time they reached Clearwater, the storm had begun to let up, the wind dying down and the snowfall easing into a gentle flurry. At the fire station, the Whitakers were given hot cocoa and warm clothes, and Shadow was checked over by a local vet who had been called in as a favor. "He's exhausted, but he'll be fine," the vet said with a smile. "You're lucky he's such a fighter." Lucas beamed, hugging Shadow gently. "I told you," he said. "Shadow's a hero." As the family sat together, sipping their cocoa and watching Shadow doze in Lucas's lap, Eric looked around at his wife and children. They were safe, together, and alive, and it was all thanks to their black cat who had braved the storm to save them. Shadow might have been small and quiet, but in their eyes, he was the biggest hero in the world. The morning after the storm, the town of Clearwater woke up to a calm, snowy Christmas day. The blizzard had passed, leaving a thick, sparkling blanket of snow over everything. Inside the fire station, the Whitaker family sat together, safe and warm. Shadow, their black-furred hero, lay curled up in Lucas's lap, purring softly. Though his small body still bore signs of exhaustion, there was a quiet pride in his demeanor, as if he knew what he had done. The story of the Christmas miracle cat spread quickly. By midday, word had traveled through the town and beyond. Locals stopped by the station to check on the family and meet the courageous cat who had braved the storm. Reporters from a nearby city arrived, eager to capture the heartwarming tale. Cameras flashed as the Whitakers shared their story, with Lucas proudly proclaiming, "Shadow saved us. He's not just a cat, he's our hero." Tom, the fire chief, stood nearby, watching the scene with a rare smile. "In all my years," he said to Dale, who had stayed to make sure the family was taken care of, "I've never seen anything like it. That cat didn't just save his family. He reminded all of us what loyalty and courage look like." Dale nodded thoughtfully, his gruff exterior softened by the events of the night before. "Makes you think," he said. "If a little cat can do all that, maybe we can all do a bit more for each other." Later that evening, the Whitakers finally made their way to Grandma June's farmhouse. When they walked through the door, the warmth and smell of fresh-baked cookies enveloped them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they let themselves relax. "Grandma, guess what Shadow did?" Lucas began, launching into the story for the 100th time. As they spoke, Shadow wandered over to the glowing Christmas tree and curled up beneath it, his green eyes reflecting the twinkling lights. Eric wrapped an arm around Holly, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at their cat. "We almost lost everything last night," he said softly, "but Shadow reminded us what really matters: family, courage, and never giving up." The family gathered around the tree, their hearts full. Shadow, the small, unassuming black cat, had given them the greatest gift of all, a second chance. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the world in quiet peace. And inside, the Whitakers held each other close, knowing they would never forget the Christmas when a cat did the unthinkable and became their savior.